In the high country of western Wyoming, in an area known as Monument Ridge, the autumn season breathes light across the forests. Aspen leaves shimmer like gold sequins against the crisp blue sky. The living pulse of mountain life in the Yellowstone ecosystem.
Aspen is a special tree. There's a sweet spot in October when all the aspens are changing and you have this beautiful contrast of bright yellow and dark green conifers.
One of the ways that you know it is fall is when the aspen groves in the mountains start turning color. It's a beautiful gold, in some cases a little bit of orange. There's really this visceral connection with seeing these trees on the landscape.
These stunning trees are far more than sheer beauty. Inside an aspen stand, the forest comes alive with a web of life that depends on these rare groves.
The Yellowstone ecosystem, it only contains about 1 to 3% aspen. It's mostly conifer, sagebrush, alpine habitat. So it's a minority feature of the landscape, but it's incredibly valuable. Then you walk into an aspen stand and it's just full of noise. You're seeing tons of mule deer and elk, and there's a higher diversity of birds. It's quite idyllic in a lot of ways.
Aspens are probably one of the most important tree species in the Yellowstone ecosystem. They are really hotspots of biodiversity and also productivity. Aspens have a much more open structure than the conifers. They allow more light to reach the ground so more plants can grow with them. Aspens also don't have as many toxic compounds that conifers might have. So as a result, animals can feed on them. They're a favorite food of beaver, deer, and elk, and moose love to browse on them.
Aspen's open canopy type system allows sunlight to reach the forest floor. There's additional resources available. And it's really the groceries found underneath the aspens that attracts a lot of the wildlife. Forbs, grasses, and shrubs. That's what makes these biodiversity hotspots.
Here in Monument Ridge, the aspen groves and the rich tapestry of life they support now face an unexpected threat by their closest forest neighbors, the conifers. Historically, wildfires once cleared out the overgrowth of conifers, allowing the aspens to regenerate naturally. But more than a century of modern fire suppression changed everything.
Without fire, many of these aspen groves were being replaced by conifers, which then meant that the fires that burn more intensely and are larger and are more difficult to control. Monument Ridge is an area that was identified as being close to houses, but also a very important area for elk and deer to have their young in.
You can think of them as either a persistent aspen stand on the landscape or a successional aspen stand. And these successional aspen stands are the ones that have adapted with fire. They need fire to persist on the landscape and to maintain themselves. And with the long history of fire suppression, it just has progressed in a direction that conifers dominate and they can outcompete the aspen. That reduces that overall value to wildlife.
For generations, fire was feared. Yet, in a place defined by wildness, fire not only destroys, it awakens and protects.
Aspen forests hold a lot more moisture than conifer trees. Conifer trees kind of dry up, they get really crispy. And so when fires are likely to happen, conifers burn at much higher severity, whereas aspen forests burn at lower severity, so more trees survive.
On Monument Ridge in Sublette County, Wyoming, a bold effort has begun. Forest managers are bringing back fire, carefully, deliberately, to revive the aspen. and, at the same time, protect communities.
The Aspen Regeneration Project is a collaboration between the Sublette Conservation District, Wyoming Game and Fish, and the U.S. Forest Service with the goal of starting to regenerate aspen on Monument Ridge by conducting prescribed fires, because Monument Ridge hasn't experienced fire in quite a while by the late 2000s, and so it had started to transition to more conifer dominance.
When we talk about prescribed fire, what we're trying to do is light fires under controlled circumstances, and it'll burn all those conifers. It'll also kill part of the aspens, but aspen roots will then shoot up and you'll get new aspens, so you're renewing the cycle. If you burn areas on a regular basis, you often improve forage for your prey animals, elk and deer and moose.
With prescribed fire, what happens is the reduction in the conifer, and aspens respond very well. They regenerate, they resprout. Sometimes we go from a couple hundred to several hundred aspen stems per acre to well into the thousands of stems per acre in a few short years following prescribed fire. And what that does, it creates a natural fuels break on the landscape in the face of large-scale wildfire, providing managers with these defensible spaces and options across the landscape to mitigate that.
Fire is an important management tool for maintaining healthy forests in the West. The Ricketts Conservation Foundation's project on Monument Ridge is studying how prescribed fires, designed to promote aspen growth, affect bird communities. Researchers are now comparing those results to what occurred after the 64,000-acre Roosevelt wildfire of 2018, which burned a third of the study area.
The Roosevelt fire burned right through the southern part of the project area and burned super hot and just roasted everything. Scorched earth, a lot of canopy loss. Whereas the prescribed fire, because it happened at a relatively wet time of year, and they did it when the winds were lower, it burned at a low enough intensity to not get out of control. And so the difference is there's a lot of birds in that prescribed fire area immediately. But when you get a really hot fire, like the Roosevelt fire, the habitat takes longer to come back. So it'll be really interesting over the next 6 years to sort of see how the bird community changes and how the birds are responding.
By comparing prescribed fires to wildfires, this study will help resource managers evaluate the effects of their decisions on aspen-dependent wildlife and guide efforts to build more resilient western forests under a changing climate.
We have a lot of pre-prescribed fire data that we can look at. We also have post-wildfire data. And now we have the ability to see how do these prescribed fires behave differently than these wildfires in terms of vegetation, regeneration, and wildlife response.
The Ricketts Conservation Foundation is also funding additional projects to monitor bird populations' response to fires.
The Ricketts Conservation Foundation started 2 projects. One is the MAPS banding. MAPS is nationwide monitoring avian productivity and survivorship to try to understand bird populations and what they're doing after fire. And so MAPS is essentially a summer bird banding program where you go out, you set up these very fine nets, and you catch as many birds as you can catch. You put little bands on their legs, you age them, you see what sex they are, and you take a bunch of measurements, and then you let them go. And then hopefully in subsequent years, you can start to get a sense of, well, what percentage are coming back, how many new birds there are. Additionally, the Ricketts Conservation Foundation partnered with the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies to design a long-term point count study, which is simply surveyors going out and counting all the birds they see and hear. And that gives you a sense of how the bird population size is changing relative to the aspen regeneration treatments.
Where flames once roared, new life takes root. In time, aspen rise from the ashes, and nature returns.
We have these birds that are really adapted to patchy fires that provide them the habitat that they need for a successful life cycle. The black-backed woodpecker is very much tied to forest fires. So they actually are feeding on the insects that are attracted to forest fires and raising their young in a recently burned aspen grove. Bark beetles will seek out recently burned areas to lay their eggs in, and because those dead trees, there's still moisture inside the stem, that then allows their larvae to develop and they reproduce that way. Lewis woodpeckers like areas that have burned recently where they're dead trees that they can sit on top of and look for insects to catch.
The Aspen Regeneration Project is a living experiment rooted in patience, guiding where, when, and how to use fire wisely to restore balance.
Moving forward into the future to mitigate against the uncertainties of climate change and to mitigate against loss of wildlife habitat, it makes sense to focus in on these areas that provide this greater value to a greater variety of wildlife, and aspens do that.
If we want aspen to persist in those sorts of places, we need to actively work to keep it on the landscape. More aspen, it would be a good thing to protect a variety of wildlife species and human health and property.
Across Monument Ridge, fire's legacy is a testament to renewal and to nature's timeless power to begin again.